The opportunity is mine to thank you all for taking time to allow me to share with you this presentation today, my first one in 2022. Its purpose is to seek to take a closer look at the present approach and strategy used in dealing with the coronavirus pandemic. This follows, of course, in recent times, a rise in recognition that COVID may be here to stay. We are in for a long haul. Scientists, public health experts, politicians, religious leaders, and many other leaders of other persuasions, certainly certain sections of the public as well, are now nationally and internationally rising to that fact. Many people had seized on the hope that COVID could have stopped in its tracks and buried for good once the vaccines began to be rolled out. That is no longer the case. Hopes for a zero COVID are fast fading away. Leading experts are seeing that COVID pandemic may also be now seen as endemic in various locales and communities of the world. They argue that if Omicron variant is anything to go by, this may be indicative of what may be lying ahead of us. In my presentation, I do seek to highlight the reasons why there must now be a pause for us to rethink the current strategy and approach to mandate vaccination. For example, no job ultimatums. And why not opt out for a more long-term and a sustainable approach rather than erect a wall of partition between the vaccinated and the unvaccinated? Away from this, the them and us divisive approach that seemingly others feel it's emerging. Could not be a better way for the vaccinated and the unvaccinated to be allowed a free choice, to work alongside each other, cooperate with one another, to find a credible solution in dealing with the future COVID variants. The voices of the unvaccinated must be listened to as much, and also the other voices that are unvaccinated. Let them, these both groups, reach a unanimity in dealing with the future variants. I will be the first to admit, and I'm not in any illusion, that COVID has left in its wake since its identification countless loss of lives. It has left in its wake pain and suffering from bereaved families, lest we forget. There are those, as I speak, hospitalized in hospitals. There are those possibly still trying to feel better, get better, recover from this ailment, from their homes overboard. We wish them, and I do wish them, a speedy recovery. Speaking of those who have been directly affected, we continue to applaud the NHS workers and all other sectors who have worked tirelessly to contain the COVID challenge in so many ways. We are grateful. That said, allow me now to share with you from the screen our presentation. I've entitled it Liberty of Conscience and the Law, a religio-legal perspective of a prophet and prime minister. Dare to be a Daniel? Liberty of conscience, which entails freedom of thought or ideas, must, through the rule of law, protect it through legislation, regulation, and policy, and not to seek to undermine it. Liberty of conscience must be seen to be protected in society. Liberty of conscience, as you will appreciate, is well, to me, defined by John Wesley. The works of Reverend John Wesley, Volume 5, page 253, talking about liberty of conscience. He put it this way: condemn no man for not thinking as you think. Let everyone enjoy the full and free liberty of thinking. Let every man use his own judgment, since every man must give an account of himself. Can I add herself? To God. John Wesley is inferring here that liberty of conscience is God-given, and therefore must not be curtailed. It must be appreciated, even enjoyed. Let it be, as we go through this presentation, that we have at the back of our minds that liberty of conscience is priceless. And therefore, come with me as I provide a context to this presentation using a character, a biblical character, in the name and person of Daniel, for reasons I will share with you while I chose this to be our model in appreciating, in leadership, as participants of each other's liberty of conscience. Daniel, as you'll see, was both a prophet, a religious leader, and a prime minister in Babylon and Medo-Persia. And it is interesting that when an evaluation was made of his leadership, In quote unquote at the bottom, he received an excellent spirit. One of my favorite writers, in a book, Prophets and Kings, chapter 44, page 546, described Daniel, this character model we are going to use, this way. He rose speedily to the position of prime minister of the kingdom of Babylon through the reign of successive monarchs, the downfall of the nation, and the establishment of another world empire. Such way, see his accolades there, his wisdom and statesmanship. So perfect his tact, his courtesy, his genuine goodness of heart, his fidelity to principle, that even his enemies were forced to confession that they could not find any occasion, any fault, for as much he was faithful to duty. If you go into the biblical text to get out the context itself, in Daniel chapter 2, verses 47 to 49, then 5 and 11. In those verses, we see that Daniel was acknowledged as a man who revered the living God in heaven and was applauded by King Nebuchadnezzar. But having acknowledged that, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon went to appoint him as prime minister of Babylon. But not that alone. With his premiership, Nebuchadnezzar asked him to be the Lord Chancellor, equivalent to our Lord Chancellor here of Babylon. Daniel, the prophet, Daniel, the prime minister, Daniel, the Lord Chancellor of Babylon. In verse 49, you'll see it says, Daniel, therefore, by the king Nebuchadnezzar, sat in the gate of the king. Very interesting. Because of the expectations of the king and the public, Daniel was positioned at the gate, meaning anything that came from the king of Babylon was checked by Daniel and communicated to other leaders and to the public. What came from the public and the other leaders went through the gate of Daniel, the prophet and the prime minister, then to the king. Verse 11 at the bottom, he was made a master of the magicians, astrologers, Chaldeans, and soothsayers. Very interesting. Daniel was not that of that mold. And yet Daniel, who had embraced his own religious liberty, his liberty of conscience, was able to network with a cabinet whose ideas were at variance and yet was able to work alongside and never caused tension or division. I hope you got the point. Daniel was made master. Daniel was made head of civil service, head of the cabinet, individuals who he respected to work alongside it in spite that they differed in their ideology. Benson commentary on Daniel, on just that phrase to explain why Daniel sat in the gate of the king, a central position. Benson puts it this way, referring to the gate position. He was a constant attendant at the king's court. That's Daniel. And as the expression may probably signify, was a kind of justice on the gate, hearing and determining such causes as were brought before him, and administering justice to the people. Powerful. Daniel was placed at a central position at the gate as a kind of justice. He worked with people of different persuasions within Babylon, I want to believe, and the people who held different ideas from him. Can you imagine how he must have dealt with various issues? And I've even said to myself, if Daniel was here today in a position which we describe, it would be interesting how he would have dealt with the COVID-19 internationally and nationally. Would it have been divisive? It's interesting, he was a kind of a justice, determining the best course to get the information across, which was productive, which was relevant, which was sustainable, as it were. Another comment from a source exhaustive Ellen G. White commentary on Daniel, on the same positioning of Daniel, the gate, puts it this way: the place where Oriental kings sat as judges and where chief councils convened. Powerful. Daniel was blessed with such responsibility. You will appreciate, provided now this kind of chart or sketch for you to see how Babylonian Empire was operated, the administrative chain of command. King Nebuchadnezzar was the monarch and also a pontiff, because he was revered to be in touch with Marduk, the chief god of the Babylonians. And then after the king Nebuchadnezzar, next you see Prophet Daniel, who was the prime minister, the Lord Chancellor, and head of judiciary. Just there you can see that whilst the king came from another religious persuasion of revering earthly gods, Daniel was the prime minister coming from another perspective, religious persuasion, where he revered the God of heaven. And yet both were prepared to work alongside each other for the entire empire for 41 years. I think you heard me correctly. Daniel served in that position for 41 years. I believe, surely it took tact, statesmanship. He did not compromise his principles, but he was able to respect, to accommodate, so that the best was brought out from a people. At the very bottom, the last arrow, you will see that was his cabinet. His cabinet. The astrologers, the Chaldeans, the magicians on one hand, then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Right there, you can see the first group was closely knit to the king, the monarch, the astrologers, the Chaldeans, the magicians, close to King Nebuchadnezzar. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego close to Daniel. And yet these two groups during the premiership of Daniel was not divisive, the them and us. They were able. Daniel was able to lead so that his influence was felt than confrontation. I would like, really with that background I have set of Daniel, we'll come back to him in a minute, that I now share with you COVID-19, mandatory vaccination. Not so much the vaccination itself, but the legislative process in the older care homes and health and wider social care sector. I must confess, it's a difficult time. It's a great challenge. I'll be the first to say I don't have all the answers. But I've often said to myself, can our approach, can our strategy be much better? You will appreciate that mandatory vaccination falls under that SI, statutory instrument, the Health and Social Care Act 2008, Regulated Activities Amendment, Coronavirus Regulations 2021. It was made on the 22nd of July. It was passed in Parliament on the 22nd of July, 2021, that is. And it came into force on the 11th of November, 2021. And yet, if I just take you first of all to the House of Lords, just 2 days before it was passed by Parliament, we're talking of a legislative process. In the House of Lords, this is what you find. Tuesday, 20th of July. The House of Lords raised concerns regarding regulations on mandatory vaccines for care home staff on Tuesday, 20th of July. The House debated a motion of regret, not of approval, but of regret, in relation to regulations on mandatory COVID-19 vaccinations for care home staff. Going a bit further down, pertaining to care home staff vaccination, the motion put forward by Baroness Wheeler, Labour, regrets that the operational guidance, please mark this, don't just be dismissive yet. Let us work alongside each other. Baroness Wheeler regrets that the operational guidance for mandatory care, home staff vaccination, will not be available until the end of July. Remember, SI, the legislation was passed, was made on the 22nd of July. Yet the operational guidance is being inferred here would not have been until the end of July. Not that alone. After the regulations come into force, and that an assessment on the impact of the care homes if staff become ineligible for work has not been published. I would want you to see a section of the debate on what is in operation. There were several speakers, obviously, because of the keeping to the rules of distance and so forth, and rightly so. Many of the peers were online. But I'm having to share with you this aspect. For our purpose, I've just chosen two. You and I have appreciated those for vaccination, and definitely must be appreciated. I do appreciate. But I believe not much either credence or listening to those who have said no to the vaccinated have been given a listening ear. I'm talking not only the public, but even individuals in position of leadership, of representing us. You will see that the Health and Social Care Act 2008, the debate in the House of Lords on the 20th of July, 2021. Listen.
My Lords, the hybrid sitting of the House will now resume. Motion to approve the Health and Social Care Act 2008, Regulated Activities Amendment Coronavirus Regulations 2021. The time limit is 1.5 hours. Lord Bethell.
Lord Bethell, acting for the government, put a brilliant, in my view, presentation, leaving the audience, I think, listening out there in any doubt, the importance of being vaccinated. But I just also want you to listen to those who had some concerns, who should not just be brushed aside. And for this, we have Baroness Knox, Conservative. Just an excerpt, you see, she began, "My lords, whether or not noble lords agree with the intent behind the statutory instrument, they ought to share my deep sense of outrage at how Parliament is being treated." Baroness Knox went on, "We have become inured to the cavalier way in which the Department of Health and Social Care uses secondary legislation to interfere with citizens' lives, but this instrument reaches a new law. For the first time since the Victorian era, vaccination will be mandated by law. I believe that is wholly inappropriate to use an amendable secondary legislation to cross that line. It raises deep issues of civil liberties and human rights, and should have been fully scrutinized in primary legislation. Not that alone. Furthermore, the department's contempt for Parliament is demonstrated by the lack of accompanying operational detail or an impact assessment, as has been pointed out. I believe this voice must not just be brushed aside. If we will, where we are heading now, in my view, if COVID challenges, the variants and their mutations will carry on, we will need all hands on board on the day. I want you to listen to Baroness Knox for a moment or so.
My Lords, whether or not noble Lords agree with the intent behind this statutory instrument, they ought to share with me a deep sense of outrage at how Parliament is being treated. We become inured to the cavalier way in which the Department of Health and Social Care uses secondary legislation to interfere with citizens' lives, but this instrument reaches a new low. For the first time since the Victorian era, vaccination will be mandated by law. I believe it is wholly inappropriate to use unamendable secondary legislation to cross that line. It raises deep issues of civil liberties and human rights and should have been fully scrutinised in primary legislation. Furthermore, the department's contempt for Parliament is demonstrated by the lack of accompanying operational detail or an impact assessment, as has been pointed out. The department has doggedly resisted releasing full impact statements on COVID orders. Whenever possible, it has hidden behind the small print of Cabinet Office rules on impact assessments to claim that they are not required. The small print does not cover today's statutory instrument, and so the department has instead resorted to, and there is no easy way of saying this, lying. The explanatory note and the explanatory memorandum state that a full impact assessment has been prepared and is available. The Minister in the other place last week admitted that it has not even been prepared. As we heard last night, a flimsy document called an impact statement appeared on the website, but this falls far short of an impact assessment. And an impact assessment published after Parliament has considered an instrument does nothing to contribute to parliamentary scrutiny. The Department has rightly drawn the condemnation of the Secondary Legislation Scrutiny Committee of your Lordship's House, which recommended in its 8th report on the instrument that consideration be delayed until both the detailed impact assessment and operational guidance were available. And yesterday's 10th report emphasised the many questions left unanswered. The Department has cocked a snook at Parliament by ramming this instrument through now. Allowing proper parliamentary debate in September would do nothing to delay the implementation of the policy. It already has a 16-week implementation gap built into it. The consultation showed that more people opposed the policy than supported it. Unison does not support it. The government cannot claim that they are acting in uncontroversial territory. And I suspect that the real truth is that this policy would never survive the scrutiny that a fully informed debate would bring. It's also far from clear that the policy solution is the right one. As the Minister pointed out, 96% of residents of older care homes and 92% in working age adult care homes have had a first vaccination dose, with the figures for staff being 86% and 83%. And these are well in excess of the SAGE guidelines of 90% for residents and 80% for staff. So in aggregate, there is no problem. Now, the Minister has said that only 65% of older age care homes were meeting the guideline, falling to 44% in London, though he gave no figures for the 2/3 of care homes that are in the sector which cater for working age adults. Now, these limited data do not provide support for the intrusive rules in this order. Rather, they speak to the need for more targeted interventions on a local basis and with smaller care homes in order to level them up to achieve the very great achievements that have been achieved so far at national level. My Lords, none of this is explored because we have no impact assessment, in particular in relation to care home staffing. Last night's impact statement came up with a central estimate of a one-off cost of £100 million in respect to the recruitment of 40,000 staff lost because of the instrument. But I do not think that that estimate will itself stand up to much scrutiny. If some staff decide not to be vaccinated, which is entirely their right to do, they will be forced out of employment in the sector. But the government have no evidence presented that there are people willing and able to come into the sector to replace that large number of people going out of it. There is no excess capacity in the market for care home staff, as many care home operators will testify. The impact of the loss of care home capacity is simply not addressed in the impact statement, along with a host of other consequential issues. My Lords, while I agree with the Noble Baroness Lady Wheeler's motion, I shall not be voting for it this evening because it is a mere gesture and it does not defend the role of Parliament. But neither shall I vote for the government.
Of course, after her, others spoke, but another voice, really, which should not just be brushed aside, is that of Baroness Forster of Oxton, also Conservative. I am a great supporter of the vaccines, she began, but I will not support coercion or anyone being forced to have it to keep their job or feed their family. This debate is now moving away from public health into the realms of state control. Here again, obviously, you and I may not want to buy into her idea, but she must not just be dismissed. I'm saying those who are hesitant must not just be seen as individuals who are awkward. And I will come to this point, that where we are headed for a long-term solution, I want to believe we will need each other. Just listen to what Baroness Forster had to say just 2 days before mandatory vaccination was made.
My Lords, on my election to the European Parliament more than 20 years ago, it became clear early on that the Commission, or the Executive, wielded great power. There were no business impact assessments, despite our enacting primary legislation, and they weren't keen to change the status quo. But some of us were, and eventually they gave way, albeit reluctantly. But the battles continued, as they'd never admit that they were wrong. And as for us, the politicians, a little courage and fortitude to hold your ground is it's very difficult, but it's so much easier just to give in. But the EU sought more and more centralising powers, and it aimed to micromanage every element of our lives. So we left, quite literally. When the vaccine debacle blew up last year, it summed up why we'd had to go. We wanted to take back control. Well, most of us did anyway. I do not underestimate the challenges in making the most difficult decisions which the ministers have had to make. And initially, the British people wholeheartedly supported the actions that were taken. The vaccine was and is the silver bullet, and we all bought into it. But the hand of the state, in my view, is now riding roughshod over the will of the people, still controlling everything we do and how we're allowed to think. If you question, for example, say, a lockdown or a mask, you're accused of wanting to let rip. Not my words. If you actually publicly disagree, you're normally too stupid to understand. And if you actually demonstrate, well, obviously you're an anarchist, which the majority plainly are not. So when ministers turn up to a dispatch box, hiding behind the 2020 Emergency Powers Act, without a full business impact assessment, wishing to broaden the scope, without consultation, it is a step too far. I am a great supporter of the vaccines, but I will not support coercing or anyone being forced to have it in order to keep their job or feed their family. This debate is now moving away from public health and into the realms of state control. The goalposts move daily. The public and businesses have no idea what's happening next. Contradictions abound. Pinggate, as it's called, is causing chaos. It was always advisory, but the public were deliberately kept in the dark. Thousands of workers and children have been self-isolating who are fit and well, 500,000 last week. Test and trace is all over the place. And forcibly testing school children with no symptoms, in my view, has been an outrage. And so to holidays. The announcement. The minister decides France is now in Amber Plus, despite the fact the beta variant is in Réunion, which is 6,000 miles away. It's a bit like a new Foxtrot variant emerging in the Falklands. Portugal went back to Amber, naturally post the Champions League. And the Balearics, well, that's where all the families go, and that's in Amber too. But not if it's a pilot. Concerts in Liverpool 3 months ago, Royal Ascot, Wimbledon, Wembley, no distancing, no masks, no spikes, not dangerous. Which brings me to SAGE. 366 members sit on 10 working groups and committees, 18 of whom remain anonymous. And I do not question their integrity. Unelected, wielding powers which affect our freedoms and movement and association with people. And it beats me how they'd ever agree, but they don't really, because different medics and scientists contradict their colleagues on mainstream media every day, and normally those appearing to want to wallow in bad news. The behavioural clinicians admitted that they'd used scare tactics and propaganda to make the public comply, terrified, more like it. So here we are, 18 months down the line. Ministers and politicians cannot continue to hide behind the science, advisors, focus groups, and opinion polls. It's about being accountable and transparent and bold. Can you imagine a Thatcher government, or the likes of Lords Clark, Tebbit, Lamont, Lillian, Forsyth, and many others in this House, not rigorously challenging the advice? So in conclusion, my lords, no one gave any government the authority to take away the civil rights which we earned over centuries. We fought for them and we died for them. And no government can demand respect. They have to earn it. So we, the people, will take back control. We will get back to normal. And so it behoves the minister, along with his colleagues, to make sure that happens. And finally, my lords, it gives me no pleasure to speak out against my own government, but in my view, to remain silent today would have been remiss of me.
Now call Baroness Ben.
In conclusion, Baroness Wheeler summed it this way: noble lords raised many points, and I fear there is just not time now to respond to them. Overall, this SI statutory instrument remains incoherent, muddled, and confused piece of legislation. And with her description, the vote was taken, it failed, and in 2 days' time, it was passed in the House of Commons. My take is not to put blame or who did what, but could it be now, I'll keep on coming to this position, now that we are accepting COVID-19 is here to stay, we will need each other. The vaccinated and the unvaccinated must begin to face a common enemy than against each other. No more than them and us. David Davis, to me, one of the renowned British politicians, most known to each one of us. During this period of the COVID, there was a kind of like inquiry where questions were asked. And I would just want you to listen to what he said. David Davis.
Now, the reasons against passport, there are many, but let me pick off a few, a domestic passport. Let me pick off a few. Firstly, the impact of this would be discriminatory. Under the law, it will be indirectly discriminatory, and that is illegal. You may well find it has been said that black and ethnic minority communities are less inclined to get vaccinated. Well, that would be an indirect discrimination. You've
this was more in the area of vaccine passports. I'm mindful other countries, even some close to us, deciding upon its people. Could it be with us here? Not so much to mimic what others are saying or doing, but what is being inferred here, if it is a form of indirect discrimination, we seek to work together to find that which is right, to safeguard each one. In the interview that David Davis participated, a question 17 was put to him. It was on mandatory vaccination. I just want to refer to it. Someone by the name of Mr. David Jones asked the question. My constituency has a lot of care homes, and they are largely, if not primarily, staffed by workers from overseas, many of them from the Far East. You touched on the cultural issue. It may not be correct, but I suspect that it is cultural, maybe ethical or religious reasons that are precluding a lot of these staff members that's in the care home from being vaccinated. Can it ever be right to require such staff members to be vaccinated? Can it ever be right for an employer to be allowed to discriminate against potential employees by requiring them to have proof of vaccination before they can take up their jobs? Mr. David Davis responded, First, it is illegal to require vaccination at the moment. We are bound, meaning UK, ourselves by UN and European international agreements to the use of medical treatment. Medical treatment as it stands must only be for the benefit of the person it is administered to. Medical treatment must not be administered for communal purposes. That is against both international and national laws. In this interview, it is interesting, he did reveal that he had had these jabs himself. But Mr. David Davis says, I respect those who may not be keen to have the jab. During that interview, he cited this Council of Europe, to which we are still, I think, a signatory, because that's where the European Convention of Human Rights fall in. COVID-19 vaccines, ethical, legal, and practical consideration, Resolution 2361. 731 says, ensure that citizens are informed that the vaccination is not mandatory and that no one is politically, socially, or otherwise pressured to get themselves vaccinated if they do not wish to do so themselves. Ensure that no one is discriminated against for not having been vaccinated due to possible health risks or not wanting to be vaccinated. David Davis quoted that. My point comes back. Let us hear all sides, and as much as possible for the sake of each other, we work alongside each other than a wall of partition of the them and us approach. Daniel moved from Babylon to another empire. And I just want you to see how all this plays out. This time, it was the Medo-Persia. Darius was a pontiff king, whereas Daniel was a prophet president. Very interesting. In Babylon, King Nebuchadnezzar says, well, I want you to be at the gate, to be my second in command. When the empire was run down and another empire came of Medo-Persia, Daniel was asked to continue, possibly having heard how he had performed for 41 years. Here, Daniel, you can see Darius Pontiff, the king, is now listening to Daniel's report of what is happening in the empire. Their chain of command, just like in Babylon, a little bit, you will see that King Darius was the monarch and the pontiff. Daniel, a prophet, prime minister, head of civil service. And yet, when not only a law was passed, a mandatory law was passed, which directly affected Daniel himself, his liberty of conscience was affected. Possibly as a second in command, he could have just brushed them aside and made a big thing about it. But no, he didn't. When those who went and proposed this legislation met the king, and this was the proposition, which would have curtailed a section in that empire, their liberty of conscience. Read something like this, and all the presidents of the kingdom, the governors and the princes, the councillors and the captains have consulted together to establish a royal statute and to make a firm decree, make it into a statutory instrument. What did it say in detail? That whosoever shall ask a petition of any god or any man for 30 days, except King Darius, that person, the ultimatum, he must be cast into the lion's den. We must be very careful with regulations which really may take people's liberty of conscience. Daniel was not the only one. I did show you earlier, he worshiped the God of heaven. The king worshiped the God of Media Persia. They worked alongside, but this instrument was very divisive, with an ultimatum that if anyone did not revere the king as God, that meant Daniel must stop worshiping his God, or else, if he did, he would be thrown into the lion's den. Something like that, if you please. Daniel 6:7 had a national political aspect to it. The petition with the religious implications to it and the legal ramifications to it. The state, liberty of conscience, and the law. How did Daniel deal with this? In Daniel chapter 6, 10, verse 11, not only representing himself and representing many others of his thinking, chose, while respectful to the king and to the legislation, they were reluctant to buy into it. In Daniel chapter 6, 10 to 11 says, now when Daniel knew that the writing was signed, it had received royal assent. He didn't make a big hoo-ha. He went into his house, and his windows being open in his chamber toward Jerusalem, he knelt upon his knees 3 times a day and prayed and gave thanks before his God, as he had always done. That legislation was done to curtail his liberty of conscience. He remained respectful. He remained loyal and courteous. I believe Daniel, as a leader, could have rounded up his militias or swayed one direction, the them and us. He didn't compromise his principle, but in representing the entire nation, you can agree to disagree and remain civil and united. Obviously, the law had already been signed. There is Daniel. He was thrown out of his job. It was a piece of legislation, do or die, in or out. He was. But folk, liberty of conscience is not just man-made thing, it's God-given. Like John Wesley put it, he will have the final say. That same God, the Bible tells us, protected Daniel in the lion's den. And it must not come over that because laws are made and we see other people suffering, they will always suffer. In our eyes, they may. But remember, there is a much higher power which can deal effectively with human issues. He came out alive. If you see Daniel chapter 6, 25, 28, the same king at the top, King Darius, then verse 28, saw this Daniel prospered in the reign of Darius, in the reign of Cyrus the Persian. He was restored back to his job. I know you heard me. Daniel, that piece of legislation to deprive him his liberty of conscience, putting him into some problems, God saw him through it to a point where he went back to the same job he had been deprived. And history tells us that Daniel served as prime minister of Babylon and Middle Persia for 70 years. In his 90s, they were still wanting him. Well, why bring this? In conclusion, here again, my favorite writer, Ellen G. White. Education, book Education, page 178, 173, 78, says, and I quote, "In the annals of human history, the growth of nations, the rise and the fall of empires appear as dependent on the will and prowess of man. But God, in the word of God, the curtain is drawn aside, and we behold behind and above and through all the play and counterplay of human interest and power and passions, the agencies of the all-merciful one, silently, patiently, working out the counsels of his will." And highlighted in red. Folk, if I've not said anything, let that resonate with you and me. The complicated play of human events is under his divine control. Amidst the strife and tumult of nations, he that sitteth above the cherubim, the God of Daniel, still guides the affairs of earth. COVID-19 pandemic has been divisive, has left in its wake pain and suffering. You and I may not even try to imagine what the future holds. I would like to applaud all the leaders, and I mean all, politicians, religious leaders, whether nationally or internationally. I get the impression everyone is trying the best to contain this COVID pandemic challenge. Everyone means well. If I were in that position, could I have done better? Never, ever. Rule me out. This presentation, I'm really speaking to myself. The complicated play of human events, how this COVID has played around and has sought to provide some unsatisfactory answer. You'd think the first jab would do it, the second one would do it, the third, the booster. I believe mankind is doing its best. But read that last line in red. Amidst the strife and tumult of nations, amid your confusion and mine, and I'm not talking only here in UK, but even around the world, wherever that country, east or west, north or south, amidst the strife and the tumult of United Nations, if you please, let us all remember, he that sitteth above the cherubim, the God of Daniel, remains in charge and is guiding the affairs of this planet. Therefore, as we acknowledge him, let us acknowledge each other's pain and suffering and seek to work together. And I believe in working together, the vaccinated and the unvaccinated, using persuasion, using not foul language, but kind words and understanding the pain of each other. I have every confidence to believe we will not have COVID would not have established a two-tiered type of society on this planet. Let's not allow it. The them and us, the vaccinated and the unvaccinated. That's all we are hearing. But together, appreciate each other together. And that he who still is in control of planet Earth, as we do our part, of course, we continue to lead and to guide each one of us, you and me. We have not just been left to our devices to fend for ourselves. I repeat, in the midst of it all, in the midst of this pandemic or endemic, he that is above remains in control. He will see you through. And us all, thank you for listening. Thank you that both the vaccinated and unvaccinated can make a pause to see how best we can face under this power above the common enemy, COVID, now and in the days or years to come. God bless you. Once again, thank you for listening.